thank you very much, and I want to thank Anya and the National Parents Council for inviting me here today. And I think it's great to actually have this topic discussed, because I think it's something that is very integral, I know, to a lot of the things that often in AsIAM we're trying to highlight around the experiences of young people with autism. But I think sometimes it's something that can kind of be seen as an optional extra, or something that's kind of novel but not that important. But I hope to kind of illustrate today some examples of why I think it's really important. I'm also delighted that I'm allowed to behave like a primary school child for the day. So I was meant to be going to my office after this, but if I no homework on the weekend, I suppose, so I don't have to do that now. I just want to start, I suppose. I always like to just get a sense of who I'm actually speaking to. So can I just get a show of hands of who is a parent of a child? Okay. And hands up who's working in the education space itself? Yeah, okay. And hands up who is a child or is an educator of someone with autism? Okay, so about half the room. Okay, that's perfect. It's just to give me an example as I go. What I'm going to try and do today in terms of my presentation is to focus it very much on my primary school experiences and how that links to children's voice. So I'm going to speak through them, but I'm going to try and highlight some key moments that I think are examples of the voice being heard and the importance of that. I suppose one of the things, at times I will give a few broader examples as well of things that I think are currently important, but I am going to try and keep it focused around my personal experiences. To begin with, one of the things I want to say is just why I think this is really important. I know this topic is important, and I think there's three key reasons that I think it's listening to Claire there talking about, I suppose, how our thinking around children has shifted so much and around how we actually listen to the voices of children now. But I think one of the things is, for children with disabilities, perhaps, we were really the last at the party. And I think it's one of the reasons it's particularly important to listen to the voice of people with autism now. I suppose in recent years we began to hear throughout the world the voices of a lot of autistic adults. And I think it's so important that we hear that voice, because I think if you look at disability 20 years ago and you look at hopefully where we're moving to now, we used to do things to people with disabilities, not things for people with disabilities. And often, and I particularly think of autism examples in this, how we thought we were supporting a person with autism was often completely incorrect. So for example, discouraging people from stimming, not understanding the importance of the sensory environment, forcing people into situations which would cause very high levels of anxiety. So I think so often when we're talking about something like autism, the way of thinking is so counterintuitive to how most people think. It's actually impossible to understand what you do unless you speak to people, and that's why this children's voice piece, I think, is so important. I also think there's a piece linked to this, which is the topic that I get without fail, the thing that I'm asked most about by parents when I go around the country. So I'm asked in many, many different forms, I suppose, when should parents do that ultimate piece of consultation, and that's actually talk about diagnosis with their child, or talk about the experience of having a diagnosis or being on the autism spectrum. And I think that's pretty integral to this, that actual, by talking and being consulted, that piece where you learn to understand yourself as well, and the importance of that. And I'm going to try and share a little bit around my experiences of that. The other thing that I think is quite important, and why I think it's so important that we're consulting with people at a very young age, is, I suppose, a lot of my advocacy work in recent times has been focused around adults. So it's been focused around people in third level education, and it's been focused around people in employment. And I think one of the very scary things that exists at the moment, and I have direct experience of this, is that when you're in the education system, it's quite a safe place. And by that what I mean is, your parent can play this huge role in advocating for you. And when something goes wrong, a parent in a good school can pick up the phone and can consult with the school, can raise a concern that maybe their child isn't able to do, or their child is very apprehensive about doing. Then overnight somebody moves from that very safe environment to college or to the workplace, and they alone are the person who has to advocate for themselves. But we've never actually taught the person the skill of how they do that. And by advocacy, I don't mean policy, I mean in terms of raising what your concerns are. I mean in terms of explaining when there's something going on that you don't like. And I think there's that piece at the moment where we need to build a bridge between the person becoming independent, but in that process actually learning how they're going to advocate for themselves, because I think it is quite a problem in the adult world. And the other reason that I think this is important is just the individuality piece. And I think this individuality piece in terms of disability is particularly important. And by that I mean that I think there's sometimes a challenge that when people are trying to learn, and I particularly mean educators, about very complex conditions, so whether it's autism or another disability, a real challenge for people at times is to get their head around it. And then when you go and you get training, often what happens, and people don't even always realize this, a particular image or a particular experience that disability forms in a person's head. When I give training to anybody, the first slide that I always use is I have a slide that has 10 faces on it. And they're 10 people who look completely different, but all of them are on the autism spectrum. And I ask the room to guess who's on the spectrum and who's not. And one of the most fascinating things you'll see is no two people will guess exactly the same. Because even though it's an invisible condition, everybody has a picture in their head of what it looks like. And that's not necessarily a bad thing as a reference point, but I think the challenge sometimes can be then that as an educator, you have a particular experience or a particular idea of autism, and then the person sitting in front of you can have completely different needs, and often maybe completely opposite needs from the person that maybe you were supporting last year. So there's a famous phrase in autism, which is that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And if you accept that as true, well then the only way you can actually support somebody is by consulting them and actually finding out what the experience is like for them. At this point in time, it's a good idea actually for a shameless advertisement. No, it's a free advertisement, so it's allowed, and that is that if you go to our website, one of the things we developed was a thing called an All About Me booklet that you can download for free. And it breaks autism into a series of kind of leading questions that a young person can complete and give their teacher. Because, for example, you could go to you could do a 2 years master's degree in autism, but the difficulty is you might know that the particular child sitting in front of you, their trigger is balloons, and if you bring a balloon into the room, the person will be anxious for the whole day. It's that really intrinsic and important personal knowledge. So that's why that's just a tool that may be helpful for people in that regard. So just, I suppose, before I really delve into it and get into it, one of the things I just wanted to say in relation to questions at the end, so I know Anya and her team are going to sort through some questions that I'll be delighted to answer, and I will be around for a few minutes after for more specific questions or for questions that come to people during the presentation. The one thing I always say is I'm happy to answer absolutely everything, so don't worry that you feel that you need to be politically correct or there's anything. I'll be annoyed if you ask. But the one thing that I always say equally is please don't ask me very specific questions or kind of guidance in clinical areas, because I'm not able to give you that. So I can share my experiences or I can talk about kind of advocacy points, but I can't tell you exactly what you should do for particular areas. So I always just try and highlight that at the start, because I think it's an important line that has to be drawn. Where I want to start, just before I jump right into my story and these experiences, is just to touch a little bit on, again, why I think children's voice is important, and that is to start at the actual question of what is autism. Because when I go into rooms and I say, hands up here has heard the word, every word, hand in the room goes up. But when I put people on the spot and say, can you actually explain to me what it's actually like, that experience? Most people struggle. And then you can pull up a plethora of definitions of autism from 1 to 2 sentences to several pages long if you go to the DSM. And that's fine, and it sets a scientific boundary around what the experience is. But the problem is when you actually read the definition, you're still none the wiser what it's actually like to live with autism. So I'm just going to try and give you my explanation of what autism is. That again is going to tie back to, I think, this piece around why children's voice is important. So the way I try and explain to people with autism is that it's like living in a world that isn't built for you. And the explanation that I sometimes give is the idea, without warning, without any explanation, you were picked up right now and you were dropped into the middle of a train station in Tokyo and you were asked to board the subway. And I have great fun when I go into school what she looks like, because there's people at rush hour in Tokyo who are kind of dressed like policemen, and their job is to push you onto the train until the doors close. And when I show, people are kind of grimacing and a little bit disturbed by it. But one of the things I find amazing when you watch it is the people who live in the city just stand there. They actually really make the men earn their work, pushing them onto the train until the doors close. And the reason for that is as normal for somebody living in that city as getting the dart in Dublin and not getting a seat is at a busy time in Dublin. But let's imagine what it would be like for you or I in that very different cultural experience if we were put on the train and the doors closed. The first thing is it's going to be a completely alien experience just to have that amount of people in our personal space. It's going to feel very claustrophobic, very overwhelming, very uncomfortable. All those people are probably speaking at once, so you can't actually hear yourself think. Maybe the person pushed in against this shoulder had garlic for their dinner the night before, doesn't believe in brushing their teeth. Maybe the person pushed in against that shoulder is wearing horrible perfume. And all that information is coming at you at once and is causing a huge amount of discomfort. So obviously you're very anxious, you're very distressed by this environment, and you cannot wait to get off, for the doors to open and get off the train. So the doors do open, but what everybody else is able to do is go on complete autopilot. And we all do this in the morning without even realising it. When we get off the train or we get out of our car, next thing we're kind of aware we're sitting at our desk, but we don't really have to put a lot of thought into how we did that. But you don't know where you're going next. You don't know how to actually get out of the train station. So you're a little bit anxious about that. The environment's still very disturbing for you. So maybe you do the logical thing and you go up and ask somebody for directions. We'll pretend for a second that you actually speak a little bit of the language. You go up and ask somebody for directions, and you have that experience that we've all had maybe if we've gone on holidays. It seems that the other person is speaking very quickly. Maybe things in a different culture like body language and facial expression and little rules around things like handshakes and eye contact, maybe they work a little bit differently. So you're not sure, am I being rude or am I being polite in how I'm answering the question? Is the person happy to help me, or are they annoyed that I stopped them? So at this stage you're very anxious because you're in an environment that's totally uncomfortable for you, and you're also not able to communicate effectively with other people. So what you have to do, you have to maybe go it alone, you have to try and work it out for yourself. So maybe you try and look around the room and say, is there any arrows that I could follow? And if I follow these arrows or these directional signs, I'll know I'm moving in the right direction and I'm getting closer to the exit. So you begin to follow them, and as you're doing this, you become more and more relaxed. You now have a bit of certainty, you're moving in the right direction. But even as you get to the final turn before you leave the station, what's so obvious to other people, if the sign is missing, that isn't obvious to you, and you go right back to square one. So the reason I try and use that explanation of autism is twofold. So it's to try and show it as a different culture or a different way of thinking. And what I like about it is, it's not that Tokyo is right and Dublin is wrong, but it's just a very, very different way of doing things. It's a very different culture. And in the same way, if you think about autistic people, it's not that the thinking is correct or incorrect, it's just extremely different. And in that story, all the key challenges that people with autism face, from communication to sensory processing to anxiety and predictability, they're all actually captured in it, and you can relate to them for the first time. But the reason I've given them, you can relate to them, is that's a very extreme example. The hard bit to understand is that maybe for an autistic person in Ireland, walking down the street when it's busy, coming to the class and the teacher who usually teaches you is out, going to the supermarket, maybe there is big a culture shock for that person in their own country as this would be for you. And the reason I think that story is important today is just to make two further points around children's voice, and that is that what's so important when you're making decisions for somebody or you're trying to support somebody is to actually be able to empathize with the person. And I think sometimes from a disability point of view, if people actually haven't physically experienced that or haven't really been immersed in it, it's actually very hard to empathize with it because it seems so different and it's so much to the opposite of how you think, if that makes sense. The other reason that I think it is important is, in that story, if we were to just pull out two words and explain what autism is, and this is from a famous European researcher called Dr. Peter Vermeulen, that autism can actually be boiled down to two words. It's an inability or a difficulty to predict, because everything seems so unusual, and then as a result not feeling in control. So how do you actually support a person manage better is to help them feel more in control of what's happening, more in control of what to expect. And of course a really big part of that is listening to people and hearing what their concerns or what their needs are. So kind of just with that as a backdrop and kind of by way of introduction, I just want to start kind of just exploring my own experiences a little bit with you. So I was born in the end of November 1994, and my mom always says about me that I never do anything till I'm ready, and then when I do it extremely quickly. And that literally started at birth, because I think I was 18 days overdue and then I was born in 25 minutes. And this was particularly challenging because I was 9.5 pounds. And apparently babies, when they're in the hospital, usually lose weight, but before I left I actually gained weight, and they used to bring 2 bottles in and say these are for the twins. And this is important because from the moment I was born I had this huge attachment to my mother, so she couldn't put me out of her arms for 2 seconds without me becoming extremely distressed, shouting, crying, etc. But at first I think you just attribute a lot of those things to being a difficult baby. also, I think that would be especially true if you were the first child in the family. But I was actually the third child in the family. And as I began to develop over the kind of first 18 months or so of my life, it was very obvious that there was something different about me to my siblings. And Mom, who was also a Montessori teacher, could see that there was something more different about me generally. So I had speech by my first birthday. So I was able to say, Santa, bring me car, by the following Christmas. But I wasn't able to crawl when I should have been able to walk. So my coordination, if I sat in a buggy, I would have been like back like this. If you were to sit me on my bottom, I would just fall over again. And I wasn't able to crawl when I should have been able to walk. So my coordination was actually so bad that I didn't pass my 18-month checkup. I'm thinking about applying for it again soon. But I suppose this difficulty was such that at the time they knew a lot less about autism. So at first they began to investigate things like cerebral palsy, and over time began to rule them out. But I think it was more my social development was very different to my peers. That was really very hard for people to understand in the mid-90s. So while I had lots of speech, the way I would have used it is maybe a little bit like how you might use a foreign language. So in other words, I understood the words exactly like they were printed on the page. I didn't use them in a very pragmatic way. So things like humour, sarcasm, figures of speech would make me very angry and very confused. Unless it was kind of slapstick humour, I found it very hard to understand. I suppose that, and again, this is the individuality piece that I wanted to touch upon. I think there's a tendency at times to think that all autistic people are extremely introverted people who don't want to engage or interact with other people, and that is the kind of stereotypical view of autism. But I was always very extrovert and always liked to talk a lot. Some would say too much, some probably would still say that. But the difficulty was I didn't like to interact with my peers at all. And the reason I didn't like to interact with my peers at all was if you're a person with autism, you like rules and structure and predictability. And 4-year-olds don't tend to be a great source of that. And as a result, I didn't want to have anything to do with them because I didn't know. Things were constantly changing too much and I would find that stressful. But also, I only like to talk about the things that interested me. And you know, when you're autistic, you tend to grow into your interests. So I had, from like the age of 5, this absolute fascination with Tutankhamun, and I knew everything about him, but not too many other 4 or 5-year-olds did. So the way I interacted with my peers was very different to other people. Again, it can be mixed up at times with a lack of interest in socializing, but I always had an interest in socializing. But because I was so confused by it, I opted out or I failed, generally speaking. And the way my senses developed was very different. So if we were to go, it got to a point, as I suppose I began to hit, say, 2 and 3, where before we went anywhere as a family, we had to judge what the environment was going to be like. So, well, we can't go there because there'd be too many people and the noise would upset him. We can't go there because the last time we went there, a certain food came out in the smell on the plate, and that smell got him very, very distressed. And everything was governed by this, if that makes sense. I was extremely hyperactive and very difficult to calm down, so I didn't actually sleep in my own bed as well until I was 7. When I say this at conferences, Mom always asked me to point out that she did try to put me to bed, that it wasn't just a case that I chose not to go to bed. But all of these things over time led me to getting a diagnosis of Aspergers syndrome. They abolished this a couple of years ago, so I'm still none the wiser kind of if I exist or not anymore. But I suppose at that stage, my parents went through that process that every parent goes through, where for 18 months or 2 years pursued this diagnosis thinking it was going to have all the answers and that this was going to be the reference point to access support. But in actual fact, we're kind of none the wiser about where to go after. And I think this is a problem that hasn't even kind of changed, and I think it's an area that still needs an awful lot of work. But my parents had to make quite a difficult change that I hope has changed somewhat since when I was small. So at that stage, you could go to mainstream school and just be seen as the bold boy who wouldn't sit in their seat because you didn't look any different to anybody else and you were very maybe academically able. Or you could go to special school far away from your community, even if that wasn't the right choice for you. So it was quite a difficult decision for my parents to make. So one of the things that they decided was that I would go to special education, and I spent the first 3 years of my education in a special school for people with autism. I benefited hugely from my time there in terms of having that more intensive support. So there was 3 adults and 6 children in each classroom, but also, and I think this is a really important point to make, because when I was a small child, I found it very difficult to articulate what I wanted and how I was feeling. So I'd run away from any conversation about feelings whatsoever, to the point that even though I had this, I would call it nearly an obsessional bond with my mother, I couldn't use words like I miss you or I love you, because how do I know if I miss you or how do I know if I love you? It was too difficult to quantify. So when I was a very young child, it was very hard to kind of consult me on the things that were important for me. And this is where I think it is very important the role parents can play in when the person isn't in the position to have that voice, that when parents are advocating on our behalf, that has to be heard as the voice and it has to be respected, particularly by educators. I think it's very important, because one of the things that was very positive for me during my time in special school was it was a space for my parents to say, reading, writing, etc., that's going to come later. The more important things are, can he dress himself? Can he socialise? Can we try and get a handle on some of this very, very challenging and violent behaviour? That was something that I didn't really mention, and I think it's a very strange piece of my story, because it was obviously by far the most challenging thing at home. So there'd be near daily episodes of kind of biting and kicking and breaking things that could go on for hours. But in a really strange way, and Mum and I talk about this sometimes, it was probably one of the things we were most lucky about. Because if I had had all the other challenges that I've spoken about this morning, but I hadn't had this instant need, it would have been very easy to just overlook them, or say he's just a bit quirky, or he's just a bit different. The reason I got a lot of support and my need was identified at a young age was because I had this, I suppose, very challenging behaviour. But my time in special education was hugely beneficial, and I always want to say that in the context of the time that it was in. But I guess one of the things that I want to kind of talk about, because this was really the start of the journey, if you want to talk about children's voice, after I was there for about, I suppose, 2 or 3 years, 3 years, a lot of improvements had been made in terms of my behaviour, in terms of my social skills, my ability to use pragmatic language, stuff like that. And that led to a point that there was beginning to be a discussion around mainstreaming. The first autism classes were beginning to open up, but also school culture was beginning to change a little bit. So to put it in context, when Mum was first deciding would she send me to special school or not, the words of the principal when she said, Adam will come here next year, and the response was, well, Adam has autism, the response unsolicited was, best not send him here then. So in the space of 2 to 3 years, that was beginning to shift, and my parents chose a school for me ultimately that I'll talk about in a second that was different to the one my siblings went to. But one of the things that actually happened was after that time in special school, when Mum and Dad were deciding, will we send him to mainstream or not, they were very afraid, because most people thought they were mad, to be quite honest with you. You have this really good school place, things are going well, things have calmed down. Why would you rock the boat? But they really felt that there was a value to me being educated in my community, having the chance to make friends with my peers, having access to the full curriculum, etc. And how the conversation started was discussions about, do you ever think you'd be able to go to the same to a school like your brothers and sisters? And I think this is an important thing that actually, I remember these conversations very well, and they went on over quite a period of time. But actually, me making my transition to mainstream school was something that I was very much involved in. And how the transition took place when I actually answered yes, that was very much the starting point. And the first time I was asked, by the way, I didn't answer yes. This was quite a process. I think one of the things that was important in that context was that when I made the move to mainstream, we involved lots of other people in that process. So for example, how I made the move was using a buddy system, where 3 people started visiting my school, but I also started meeting them outside of school. And slowly, over the course of about a year, visiting the classroom, going on their school tour, getting to know teachers within the school. So the transition was very, very managed. But also, I was the person driving that transition. And it meant that when I came into the classroom, there was going to be a whole understanding and awareness of me, and I was going to feel more comfortable in that context. One of the pieces here that becomes relevant is, well, at this stage, did you know you had autism, or did you know you had Aspergers? Because being in a special school is by no means prerequisite for that you will know about your diagnosis, because many people don't know. But certainly from I was being assessed from such a young age that it would have been something that would be very difficult to hide from me, because I was quite inquisitive in how I asked about things. And how it used to be explained to me from a young age was just in a very natural way. So, you know the way you're very good at A, B, and C, but you find D, E, and F, I got stuck there for a second, very hard, and this is called Aspergers. So in other words, it was something that was just completely melted into our conversation. Now, I want to be clear in saying that I don't believe that there's a right or wrong way to do disclosure. So it's very much something that the parent has to drive, and the parent knows where their own child is at. But when people ask me, was it a good or a bad thing, or how should I do it, I think it was very important. And from talking to lots of other young autistic people, there's a perception sometimes, and again, I think this is where we come back to this empathy piece, that the person with autism won't be aware that they're different, or won't be aware that they're struggling, etc. But in actual fact, most people are, but the difficulty is that if you don't have a reference point or a word to understand why you feel that way, then it's very easy if someone calls you weird or strange in school, or you begin to struggle in school, to feel very isolated and feel very misunderstood, because you don't actually have a word or a reference point to understand yourself. So from a young age, Asperger's was something openly discussed. Again, in an age-appropriate way, so we didn't go through the triad of impairment or anything as it was then, but it was something that was just part of day-to-day life, like the hand you write with or the colour of your eyes. And this was important because before I went to school, my parents allowed a conversation to happen in the class about what autism was. And again, don't think it was in a very in-depth way, but it was about difference and how we're all different, and a boy who'd be coming to the school next year and who might do certain things in certain ways. And again, I find that was extremely important, because it meant that as I got older and I was having difficulties in certain areas, I felt more comfortable explaining them, and also people knew how to respond to them. I think sometimes there's a problem, and I think if there's one lesson we should have in Ireland is that we've tried that thing with lots of social issues where we don't speak about them, and it's never worked. And I don't think it will work with disability either. I think the more open we can be and normalising it, and I think that's why things like the new RTE programme that's just started, Pablo, where from a very young age we're portraying autistic people, we're normalising it into our conversations. I think that's something that is going to be extremely, extremely important. Another thing that was important in terms of school culture, and again this links back to Children's Voice, was I was lucky that my parents chose a very inclusive national school to send me to. And it wasn't the school that my siblings went to, it wasn't the patron body that would have been my parents' natural choice, but it was the school that had the most inclusive principal. So a principal that really believed in this, no one was making her do it, but she wanted to do it. It was also a much smaller school environment, and that made it a lot easier for me. And quite critically, there was no staircase, which sounds like a small point, but was actually a very big point, because my coordination was still very poor, and some would say is still very poor, and not having to deal with stairs was going to be something that was important in the context of the transition. But in terms of the really important piece about that school was they had a very inclusive culture that was all centred around what my needs were and how they could meet them. And it was very much a strength-based model. And how I wanted to highlight that was, for most autistic people, if you're not interested in something, you quite simply can't and won't engage with it. Now, very often the way the education system works is it's like a square peg in a round hole, so it's really trying to force the person in to do something that their mind doesn't think in that way. So for example, when I made the transition, I was a whole year to maybe 18 months academically behind my peers, so I had very limited reading, I had very limited writing. My writing was that size, it's now about that size. But there was still huge issues around my academics. But if you were to just sit down with one of those copybooks with all the letters and get me to do it, nothing would have happened or nothing would have changed. But what they did was, they looked at the areas that I was very interested in and very good at, and they tried to drive the areas that I needed support in through those. So taking very much a strengths-based approach, as opposed to what can often happen with disability, which is we just look at the dis part of the word, focus on that and try and fix it. So my special interest from a very young age was history. So how they taught me to write was to do history projects where I could only go on to the next page after I'd done the first page to a certain level. How they taught me to read was through stories and stuff that would engage me. Because at that stage, there would have been a very noticeable gap between me and my peers, and that becomes obvious, especially as a person gets older. They made sure that when I did history projects, that I would then present them to the class so that my peers could see me being the best at something, and not just always the person who couldn't do certain things. And I think that's what's really important, that in the school, when I found something difficult, or they tried to go back to my strengths and how they can use them. I think that's a really practical example of children's voice. I'm not saying in terms of focusing on what I could do, and maybe not always the things I was saying, but the things that were very obvious that were important to me. There's another piece to this as well that I think is important in terms of my transition, and it comes back to the parents' role in all of this as well, which is that piece of the loving push. So if anybody knows Dr. Temple Grandin and has heard her speech, she speaks about this a lot, is that very fine line between making all of the adaptations that I needed and still need, but also being that person to push just outside the comfort zone. So not leaving anyone stuck or throwing anybody in the deep end, but stretching in the way that parents do anyway. And I think this is a really important role for parents in the context of children's voice, because I think the worst thing that can happen at times is when the education system decides it will lead on what the loving push is, if that makes sense. Nobody can intuitively understand the experience of somebody with autism better than their parent, because nobody will know that person better than their parent. And it's a very important role, I think, as somebody's growing up, and it's a pretty sacred role that very few people other than parents can do in a safe way, to actually identify what the person's real concern is, where they do need adaptations, but where there's that bit that you can just place outside the line. So you're not, and I'm going to give a very concrete example of that. So when I was younger, and still, one of my big sensory triggers is the smell of crisps. So when I smelled those as a young child, it would get me extremely distressed, and I would immediately go into kind of meltdown mode. So it was something that I couldn't filter. For people who aren't familiar with autism, to just explain, if anyone knows what nails down a blackboard sounds like, so nobody says I dislike nails down a blackboard, because we all have things we dislike. But if I was to do nails down a blackboard now, no one in the room can function until I stop. So if you understand, for autistic people, very normal things in the environment that you mightn't even be aware of may be a very big trigger for somebody, and it could be something from a particular type of clothing through to a particular type of smell. So for me, when I was a young child and I was having meltdowns every second day over certain smells, Mom, in panic mode, did try to crisis manage, I suppose. So in other words, nobody was allowed to eat this in the house, nobody was allowed to eat that in the house, etc., etc. So what actually happened very quickly was the 5-year-old began actually running the house, and everyone was quite afraid. Over time, Mom realised that wasn't sustainable, because she realised two things. On the one hand, that these things were actually extremely painful for me, and that I couldn't be exposed to them, or to be left in situations where I wasn't in control of that situation, because that would cause me huge stress, would lose trust completely, but also just wasn't fair. But on the other end of the scale, I also couldn't control everybody in the house. So the situation that emerged with Mom got support, and when I was in special school, was that when I was in school, when I was at home, if people wanted to eat certain foods, I had to leave the room, but nobody could come into my room. And after the person was finished eating that food, they would have to brush their teeth. So if it makes sense, I was completely in control of myself, but I wasn't in control of everybody else. And that skill then, one of the things as you grow older with autism, is you learn to curate your own life, if that makes sense. So you learn skills to manage day-to-day situations. And that starts at that piece of the loving push. But it's a really important role for parents, because it involves hearing that person's voice and understanding, and it involves, in a very careful way, applying that to the environment. And it's a really important role that I think only parents can really play for us. The other thing that I think was very important in that context was socializing. So Mom never made me socialize with anybody, but never let me stay at home either. So from a very young age, I was exposed to lots and lots of different things. And again, from a children's voice point of view, there were things that I was interested in. by interest in, that doesn't always mean good at. So I think I joined just about every sport from kind of sumo wrestling down, and I was never good at any of them. But that wasn't what was important. It was that I was interacting with my peers. Not in a socializing way where there's no script, but I was side by side. And that meant that as I got older and when I was in secondary school, that I had that contact and that opportunity to socialize when I was ready and had learned the skills to use it. And that's why I think, again, following interests can get around so many of these things. And with autism, particularly for somebody who isn't particularly expressive or doesn't really always explain what it is or how that they feel, following interests can be a really good way of giving that person a voice and of putting that person in an environment where they can succeed. The other thing that Anya mentioned briefly, I suppose, in the context of my introduction, was I had an SNA when I was in national school for 5 years. That SNA was a very important person for me in terms of helping me to navigate the school environment and at times for being my voice. And I think this is an important piece that, again, parents can play a lot of the time outside of the school context or sometimes at things like school meetings. And that is that sometimes a person has something that they want to say, but actually verbalizing that and getting it out can be an enormous problem. So when I was in school, certain things that would really, really upset me, but might be very small, I wouldn't, even though I knew them exactly, be able to articulate them. And because I wasn't able to articulate them, something that was a very small problem could become an enormous issue. And if you had a teacher who maybe didn't really understand autism, or it was the start of the year, for example, and they were getting to know you, it might be very hard for the person to naturally pick up on what those things were. So I think sometimes the important piece and where the support that can be really important is that ability to interpret what a person wants. But I think what's also as important in this piece, so that's the kind of positive part of the support, is that we really need to look from quite a young age, and we need to listen from quite a young age about how people want to be supported when they're in school. This is a problem. I have had experiences of that when I was in school where mama had to play that role of sometimes also giving me the space to fail as well, but in a controlled way. So that very narrow gap between supporting somebody and caring for somebody. And at times, I think when those lines became muddled, as you get older and you become more conscious of having support, that can be a very frustrating thing. I know for me that one of the things that I'm seeing in my advocacy with older people and adults, and we mess up how they're supported, is that when we're in school, when people are in school, that has serious repercussions throughout their life. So, for example, I've been working in DCU for some time around making it an autism-friendly university. And we did a big consultation, we're about to publish the research of students with autism and what their needs were and how they felt about the campus. What was really interesting was half the respondents to the survey hadn't registered with the disability service and had never told anyone in the campus that they had autism. And there was different reasons for that, but all of them could be broadly boiled down to, when I told someone in the past, I found the support I got to be patronising, or I felt people didn't understand. So often how a person had experienced support in primary or secondary school actually influenced their ability to advocate for themselves into the future. And that's why I think it is really important from a young age to try and think, A, how a person wants to be supported and how we can do that, but B, also, how can we make the way we provide support respectful? And I think this is really, really important, even just in terms of, I remember when I was in the latter half of national school, so like in 5th and 6th class, and you'd have to leave things like, I'd sometimes have to leave for things like resource and for things like next assessments and stuff like that. And actually this is also at the time when you're in school and for the first time you actually really realise what it's like to be different. And there's that bit where there's the knock on the door and you have to go and you have to leave the classroom. All sounds very small things, but for a child at that time, from my experience, it can feel like it's making you more different or that it's highlighting you more. So I think that there is just a consideration, something that might seem very small that we mightn't even think about, but how we provide support, I think we really need to listen to the student about how that works and how we can do that well. And linking to that, I think this is something very important, which was that we sometimes, and again it's this double empathy problem, unteach people the learning skills that they are teaching themselves. And I think sometimes this is where the education system can be particularly guilty of. So for example, I don't know if anybody can see from where I'm standing, I'm not wearing any shoes when I'm speaking to you now. And the reason I'm not wearing any shoes is when I stand, it's very hard for me to concentrate sometimes, and also if I'm concentrating on one, if I'm standing, it's very easy for me to begin to stim, which is what I run around when I do that. Me standing here without shoes on, the pressure of the ground, I can do balancing things with it, and it helps me to stand still. Now, very often, things like that, things around stimming, things around sensory controls, when we have someone in school, we say, don't do that, or that's not appropriate, or we shouldn't do that. But we actually have to realise that there's lots of ways people learn to cope, from how they sit in a chair, to how they overcome a particular barrier, to maybe things like earphones or other things they might use, that when we actually see somebody find a way that they're not opting out of an activity, but they're actually managing it so that they can participate, that would be something that we really welcome and we really encourage. And I think that's, again, another example of how voice isn't always words. And I think it's particularly important that we realise that, because, again, one of the things that I think is sometimes concerning, even now when we talk to people with autism who are less independent maybe, or who are less verbal, we talk to the person that they're with, and we don't realise that there's a lot of ways to communicate other than using words. I think that's just a really important thing to keep in mind. And I suppose where I want to just kind of finish up is that final piece as well of the importance of learning to explain. And that's something that I think, again, it comes back to this piece around disclosure, and enabling a person to understand themselves is actually also a key part of giving them a voice. Because the reason I do the advocacy work that I do now, and the reason it started very much in national school, there's key moments in secondary school, but it started in national school because it is really entertaining when you have a diagnosis of something and you talk to members of the public and you see how they respond to that information. Because most people in Ireland really want to be inclusive, they want to do the right thing, but most people don't know what that is. And from quite a young age, I found when I was in national school, from maybe about 4th, 5th and 6th class on, you begin to notice, and it's not in any way badly intentioned, but maybe sometimes when people are speaking to you, they're speaking that little bit slower, or they're speaking that little bit louder, or sometimes you notice that there's a lot of assumptions about what an autistic person might like to do, what they might not like to do, a lot of decisions that never actually reach the autistic person. And I think it's very important that people are given the skills and understanding about themselves that they can correct that sort of thing. Because a lot of young people, when I meet them now, are still very frustrated about this. And it's these sort of reactions at times that can actually reduce their voice and make them less likely to want to advocate for themselves or to participate. So I suppose to finish up, what I just wanted to say was that I think that the importance of students' voice is so important in terms of while a person's still in education, from an early stage building them up towards independence. Because again, this is something that I think in Ireland we're still quite bad at, that actually there is a lot of support when people are in school still, but there's a sudden cliff edge. And the cliff edge is partially to do with resources, obviously, but it's also partially to do with actually, we don't actually do anything to build up the person's ability to advocate for themselves. And the second thing that I think children's voice is important for is it's about mutual understanding. And this is what's really, really important about this whole autism-friendly piece, this whole disability piece that we hear, which is that it's not a case that we just help a person to adapt, nor is it a case that the world just adapts for a person. But I think sometimes a lot of the challenges people face in the world come from mutual misunderstanding. And that's why it's really, really important that it's only by listening to that voice. Autistic people or people with disabilities have always heard the other voice, but I think at times that voice has been absent from the room, and I think that's what's really important. So thanks again for having this on, and I'd be delighted to hear any questions.